Hi, everyone. Welcome, curious travelers of history. When Columbus first encountered the people, the interactions were peaceful and filled with curiosity. They generously shared food and gifts, offering a glimpse into their rich culture. However, Columbus misunderstood many aspects of their society and began taking some as guides, shaping the course of future encounters. Christopher Columbus had sailed across the Atlantic Ocean for over 2 months when he finally spotted land. And it wasn't just any land. It was the island of Hispaniola, now known as the Dominican Republic and Haiti. This was on Christmas Day 1492, a day that would change history forever. As soon as he arrived in this new place, Columbus began searching for gold. But before he could find any, he met the natives who lived there. They were peaceful people, and they welcomed the Europeans without any weapons or hostility. This encounter is one of the most important events in world history, and it has been depicted countless times in books and movies. But what really happened when Columbus first met the people? We will take a look at the various accounts left behind by Columbus and his crew. And through their words, we will see how these two very different cultures first interacted. The men had been sailing on the ocean for so long that they had forgotten what land looked like. So when they saw it in the distance, they all shouted for joy and began to pray. When Columbus realized it was an island, he decided to sail around it to see if there were any people living there. The next morning, they anchored off the coast and sent out a boat to go ashore. They landed at a beach near a river and made their way up it. Soon they heard drums and other noises coming from the forest. They didn't know what to expect, so they hid behind their guns. But when the natives came out, they saw that they were unarmed and didn't seem to be a threat. These natives were members of the Taíno tribe, and they were some of the friendliest people Columbus had ever met. The people were short in stature, with skin the color of bronze. They were muscular and strong, and they had long black hair and wore it in a queue, which is a style of wearing one's hair. They were dressed in loincloths made of cotton or animal skins, and they had necklaces made of beads and feathers around their necks. The man who greeted them was named Gakonagari. He was the chief of the village, and he was very curious about the Europeans. Gakonagari and his men had never seen anyone like Columbus and his crew. They were taller than the natives, and they had beards and long hair. The Europeans were also wearing clothes made of wool, and they had horses with them. All of this was very strange too, and they wanted to know more about these visitors from another world. The people were very welcoming and hospitable. They offered the Europeans food and drink, and they showed them around their village. They also gave them gifts, such as necklaces made of beads and feathers, that were very impressed by the Europeans' horses, and they asked if they could have one for themselves. Columbus agreed, and he gave them a horse that had been captured from the Indians. That were very happy with this gift, and they treated the Europeans like kings. Columbus and his crew stayed in the village for several days, and during that time they learned a lot about the people. They learned that they were a peaceful people who lived in harmony with nature. They also learned that they were very skilled farmers, and they grew crops such as maize, cassava, and sweet potatoes. They also raised pigs and chickens, and they hunted deer and other animals. The people were very impressed by the Europeans, and they thought they were gods. This was because the Europeans had come from a place that the Peker had never heard of, and they had brought with them strange foods, animals, and plants. The Europeans also had guns and other weapons that they had never seen before, and they thought that this made them super powerful. After staying in the village for several days, Columbus and his crew had to get back to their ships. They said goodbye to the people and promised to return soon. However, this was not the case, and it would be several years before Columbus and the would see each other again. When Columbus returned to Hispaniola, he was looking for gold and other riches. He had heard that the island was full of gold, and he wanted to find some for himself. He also wanted to find slaves to work on his plantations. The people were perfect for this job, and Columbus began to enslave them. He and his crew also began to take the on raids to other islands, where they would kill the natives and take their gold. The people were very sad to see that the Europeans had turned on them, but they couldn't do anything to stop it. The Europeans were too powerful, and there were no match for their guns and other weapons. One of the things that really impressed the Europeans was their knowledge of astronomy. They had never seen a European use a compass or an astrolabe, but they knew that the Europeans were using these devices to navigate the seas. They were very curious about these devices, and they asked the Europeans to teach them how to use them. The Europeans agreed, and they taught the basics of navigation. This is one of the few instances where they were able to learn something from the Europeans, because most of the time it was the other way around. They were very intelligent, and they were able to learn quickly. In fact, one of the men, named Rodrigo de Triana, became the first European to sight the mainland of the United States. He was on one of Columbus's later voyages, and he sighted land on October 12, 1492. Rodrigo was able to identify the land because he had learned how to use a compass and an astrolabe from the Europeans. As time went on, Columbus and his crew became more and more greedy. They wanted more gold and more power, and they were willing to do whatever it took to get it. They began to mistreat the people, and they even began to kill them. They were very sad to see that the Europeans had turned on them, but they couldn't do anything to stop it. The Europeans were too powerful, and there were no match for their guns and other weapons. In the end, the people were nearly wiped out by the Europeans. Most of them died from diseases brought over from Europe, and the rest were enslaved or killed. If it hadn't been for a few brave men and women who escaped to the mountains, there would be no people alive today. Even though the people suffered greatly at the hands of the Europeans, there are still a few of them alive today. They live mostly in the mountains of the Dominican Republic and Haiti, and they are trying to keep their culture and traditions alive. It's important to remember that the people are real people with a rich culture and history. They were not just a bunch of savages that the Europeans encountered. They were intelligent, strong, and resilient people who were able to survive for centuries in a very hostile environment. Though most of the Taíno people were killed or enslaved, there were a few who managed to escape. These Taíno men and women fled to the mountains of the island, where they lived in hiding. They were able to avoid the Europeans for many years, but eventually the Europeans found them and began to attack them. The Taíno fought back, but they were no match for the Europeans' guns and other weapons. In the end, most of the Taíno were killed, but a few managed to escape. Today, there are a small number of Taíno people alive, and they are working to keep their culture and history alive. In conclusion, the first meeting between Columbus and the people was a momentous occasion in world history. Though Columbus was looking for gold and other riches, he found much more than he bargained for in the form of a peaceful and welcoming people. They impressed the Europeans with their knowledge of the island and its resources, as well as their skills in agriculture and navigation. Despite the eventual tragic fate that befell the people, their legacy lives on in the history books, and in the hearts and minds of those who remember them.